Hey everyone, we've got a security/identity related episode lined up for you today, and I've got Paul Schnackenburg on the show, and we're going to be talking about conditional access inside of Entra ID. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what conditional access is, at a super high level, you've got a resource that you as the end user are trying to access. Conditional access defines these conditions that the user has to meet in order to access that resource. Now, of course, that's a massive oversimplification. In execution, conditional access is far more complex than that and more nuanced, and that is exactly what Paul and I have lined up for today's episode of SysAdmin Weekly. Hey everyone, it's a new week. That means it's time for another episode of SysAdmin Weekly. This is your podcast by sysadmins for sysadmins and dedicated to all the tireless tech folks working in the trenches, keeping our digital world spinning. As always, I'm your host, Andy Serwich, and I've got a familiar face on the line here with me today. I've got Paul Schnackenburg. How's it going, Paul?
I'm good, thanks, Andy. How are you?
Doing good. Folks, if you don't know who Paul is, you'll have to go back and look at one of our earlier episodes, but Paul's a super smart Microsoft guy, runs his own consultancy business over in Australia. So it's always fun recording with you because it's 9:45 p.m. at night for me. And if I'm correct, it's 11:47 a.m. the next day for you.
That's right. I'm calling you from the future, but I can't tell you what's happening because then I'll have to kill you. That's right.
Time zones, fun times. So it's always good having you, Paul. I appreciate you being here.
Yeah, it's good. I really enjoy our talks, and hopefully they're useful to our.
Yeah, and we've got a fun conversation lined up today. Today we are talking about conditional access, and assuming I post these episodes in the correct order, last week you probably heard an episode from Eric and I that covered the top skills that top Microsoft skills that sysadmins should have in their tool belts. And we talked briefly about both group policy and conditional access because they kind of do some of the same stuff, not all, but I'd be interested to get your take on this, Paul, but I've always said that conditional access is kind of, sort of the group policy of the cloud era, one part of it, right? I mean, group policy does so much, but...
I've also compared them to your firewall rules because they're sort of a little bit similar in that sense as well. So, they are definitely a core skill today. I mean, they've just kept on growing and growing and becoming more and more and more important. So absolutely.
For sure. Well, before we dive too deep into that particular subject, we've got, of course, our usual recurring segments on the show. So first, I want to make sure that I remind everyone all the different ways they can reach our show. So you can go out to www.sysadminweekly.com, and that has all the different links to all the show resources, the different places you can watch it, a link to our contact mailbox. So if you haven't heard, you can reach us at contact@sysadminweekly.com. You can also comment on any of our YouTube videos or any of our Spotify episodes if you want to provide feedback or have a comment read on the show or anything of that nature. So with that, we also have a weekly newsletter where we share some of the more recent links associated with the shows, talk about some of the episodes. We also share a bunch of fantastic, super useful community content as well. I do a short editorial, not too long, not too short, hopefully. I try to hit that sweet spot, but anyway, be sure to check that out as well. That's newsletter.sysadminweekly.com as well. So our first recurring segment that we are hopping into is our News React segment. And this is the segment of the show where my co-host and I, we talk about a IT technology related news item that kind of caught our eye in the last couple of weeks here. And because I live in the M365 and security world, there's one that came across my desk that I found interesting. And this is very M365 specific. More specifically, it's Exchange Online specific. So we all know that when you set up a M365 account, you are given and I never say the acronym right, Paul. I always say like MOERA, but really what that stands for is Microsoft Online Email Routing Address. And what it is, it's your onmicrosoft.com address. And it often surprises me that there are admins out there that aren't aware that those are usable email addresses. They can be used to route mail. And with that in mind, you have to secure them just like you secure your normal mail traffic, right? But the news is that Microsoft has had such an issue with bad actors using .onmicrosoft.com domains for illicit purposes that they are now going to put a rate limit on the usage of those domains for sending emails. And if I remember correctly, they are going to throttle that to 100 external recipients per organization per 24-hour rolling window. So this is a anti-spam, anti-abuse move in my eye, is how I see that. So
completely, that's exactly what it's for. Because bad guys sign up for a trial tenant. Now they have an onmicrosoft.com domain that looks, there's something onmicrosoft.com that is potentially going to be more likely to bypass spam filters, and then they blast out emails. But if they can't send more than 100 in every 24 hours, that's not very useful. But if you're trying out, you're a normal person and not a criminal, and you're trying out Microsoft 365, of course you can play around with it and send a few emails and learn how things work and whatever. And 100 emails, 24 hours, that's pretty good. I mean, you can live with that. That's good enough to try it out.
Yep, exactly. So yeah, that was my news item for the episode, and I'll be sure to include a link to that in the show notes, as well as whatever news story that Paul has lined up for us. Paul, what do you got?
So I got two. Just rounding off one that we discussed in an earlier episode that I was on, SK Telecom in South Korea. Had all their SIM cards stolen, and then they had to replace everybody's SIM card, and they literally stopped, I think, for a while, quite a few weeks, they stopped new signups as well, and they presumably also lost a whole heap of customers who went like, well,
sure.
if you can't even secure your stuff, this is terrible.
Right.
So to round off the story, they've just been fined by the regulator in South Korea a whole, off the top of my head, $97 million or something like that. So, an extra little cherry on top of that cake. So I'm sending you a link into the show notes here with where you can read a little bit more about that. So my actual news item is Intel. So you may have heard in the news very recently that the not at all socialist government in the US has taken a stake in Intel, and I am assuming they're going to socialize other corporations in the home of capitalism. But that's not the news. The news is, why are we here? Why is Intel struggling so much? And it always never made sense to me, because they basically owned the processor market for decades at this point, right? Like AMD has been nibbling on the side. And how did all this all happen? Well, I found out from some experts who actually know what they're talking about. So this wasn't something I came up with. It's 2006 or so. Apple goes to Intel and says, hey, we're building the iPhone. I mean, they probably didn't call it the iPhone then, but they said, hey, we want you to make us a processor in our new concept for a smartphone, right? We're going to release the iPhone. And Intel said, no, that's a low margin, high volume business. Oof. And we don't basically need that, because we're leading everywhere else in every other processor. And fast forward 10 years, ARM has become the preferred in all devices, including starting to become so in laptops. I don't think I'm ever buying an Intel or AMD-based laptop for myself ever again. They're going to be Qualcomm because they're just better. And of course, Apple makes their own ARM processors, both for their computers and their tablets and their phones, right? But what that leads to is, when you don't have the volume income from selling lots and lots and lots of CPUs, you don't have the money to do the R&D. And when you're in the processor business, you can't afford not to do the R&D to be on the leading edge. Hence, Intel is now really, really struggling, and they've basically given up in devices, and AMD is going to eat more of their cake, and Qualcomm and other ARM processors, including Apple's, of course, are going to take an even bigger chunk. And it's that's you got to think. You got to think long term. Short term, maybe they wouldn't have made much money, but they would have made enough money to keep their R&D going. And now they're just scaling down to survive, which means they'll do even less R&D, which means they'll be even less on the leading edge, and then spiraling down.
How do you stop that spiral if you're Intel? That's tough. Yeah. Very tough. And like you said, I mean, I can speak for myself as well. I mean, I think I've told the story before on the show. This was probably 4-5 years ago. I had a Surface Book 2, like the top-end model Surface Book 2 with the discrete NVIDIA graphics card in it. I forget what the CPU was. It was an Intel chip. But, like, that thing should have been hovering on my desk with as much horsepower as was in it, right? That thing just... It struggled. It just struggled with certain tasks. And I know there was probably some thermal stuff going on, of course, because it's strange chassis and whatnot. But here's what really blew my mind. I had always kind of been interested in, stepping into the Apple desktop ecosystem, right? Mac OS. So I'm like, okay, I can get an entry-level Mac Mini for, I don't know what it was at the time, $500-$600, right? I got the entry level Mac Mini with the then M1 processor, right? Which is an ARM-based processor. That thing ran circles around that Surface Book. Yep. I mean, like, no comparison. And it was silent and heat efficient while it was doing so. I was shocked. And it was at that point where I was sold, not just on Apple's ecosystem, but because I can also natively run Unix utilities on Apple, which is great for me. But also, I became an ARM fanboy at that point, right? So it was, big deal. So I and then pair that with the fact that anytime I talk to anyone about gaming PCs, Intel never comes up anymore. They're going for an AMD Ryzen or something along those lines, right? And I'm surprised. I actually, in my Linux box downstairs, I have a fairly beefy Linux box that has an AMD Ryzen 7800G, which it's a chip that actually has embedded Radeon graphics on it. I think it's like an 860M equivalent or something like that. And I'm shocked at how good that chip is for graphics workloads, and it's all on the same chip. I'm not running, like the new Metal Gear Solid 3 remake or anything with it, but it can do some light gaming and graphic workloads. Intel's getting it from multiple directions, right? So I don't know. Be interesting to see where they're at in 5 years. Hopefully still around.
It's one of those things, right, that they seem so big, they seem like they can never fail, right? And then you just look back and you go, that's when it happened. I think I would have said actually the first nail in the coffin was, and apologies to everybody who's young, who's listening now, you will not know this story. Intel made 32-bit processors. Well, I mean, originally they made 16-bit processors, but they were making 32-bit processors, and which means they could only address a maximum of 4 gigabytes of memory, right? 2 gigabyte user space, 2 gigabyte kernel space, which of course we realized 2 decades plus ago now that, hey, that's not gonna fly in the future. We're gonna need 64-bit processors. They came up with their own architecture, the IA64 architecture. Intel was the leader, and they said, this is what we have to do. And every piece of software on the planet and every piece of, including operating systems, will have to be rewritten to work on the IA64 platform. And AMD went, Nah, I don't think that's true. We'll make you a 64-bit processor that emulates a 32-bit processor. Here's the x64. That's going to work well. Intel held in for maybe 6 months or a year, and then they went, oh, actually, you're right. This is much better. You don't have to rewrite anything. You can run every 32-bit app you want. It'll work right fine. And then you can write 64-bit apps on top of that. Life is good. And so AMD made the x64 architecture that we're all running now, unless you got an ARM processor. So,
right, man. The IA64 architecture, I had forgotten about that. That's how short of a time period it was around, but I do remember that. It's, man, crazy.
Yeah.
Well, some good stuff there. We could almost do a whole episode on the drama with Intel these days, so maybe we'll have to revisit that at some point. So, the next segment we've got before we get into our main topic is our Nerd Hour segment. And of course, it doesn't take an hour, but this is just the name of the segment where my co-host and I, we discuss the nerdy, geeky things that we've been working on either in our professional life or our personal time. And like I mentioned last week, I have been, and it's relevant for today's episode, I, for the first time in a while, had to configure break glass accounts and set up a M365 tenant, harden it, secure it, all that stuff, right? It's been a long time since I've worked on a fresh tenant like that, one that has not been already established, right? But that said, the geeky, nerdy reason that I'm talking about today was the whole thing that prompted that is I've got an admin portal. For various reasons, I am not able to cordon off from the public internet. Well, SaaS reasons. It's a SaaS hosted service. I don't have control of the vendor's domain, so I can't filter based on DNS name, right?
Yep.
So I'm like, okay, how am I gonna harden this thing? And what had originally been the plan was to gate this admin page behind an M365 login. So that was the whole purpose for hardening this M365 tenants, which I was able to use Cloudflare to create a reverse proxy and still do the routing. But there's one issue that remains. The original URL is still reachable because, like I said, I don't have the control over the vendor's domain name and DNS settings, right? So I still have some stuff I got to figure out there. But basically, that's my security brain and work, right? Hey, there's this admin portal that's reachable on the public internet. Yeah, it's secured with FIDO keys and MFA and all that, right? But I still don't feel great about the admin interface being publicly accessible. So I'll get it solved here soon. I just got to figure out the best way. So that's what I've been working on. What do you got, Paul?
So my Nerd Minute, we should really rename it to Nerd Minute, I think. But my Nerd Minute is actually an honorable mention as well. But I've been working with Meister. We're going to talk more about Meister later on here. But in short, it's an open source free solution that lets you test your conditional access policies against various frameworks and best practices, and gives you a list of suggestions of things you should fix in your conditional access policies. So if you're a sysadmin here that has anything to do with Entra ID and conditional access in any way, you should have a look at Meister. As I said, it's completely free. A non-programming idiot like me can use it, so you absolutely can use it. It is not hard. And we'll talk more about it as we get into the show. But that is a thing that I've been playing around with, and I'm really grateful to Meryl Fernando and the two MVPs that have been working on it. My honorable mention is I'm an Android user. I've been an Android user for a long time, and my old phone is not working 100%. It doesn't actually make phone calls sometimes, which is a little bit of a problem when you have a smartphone. People are trying to get it. So I literally got my new phone only a few days ago. So for those of you who are watching the video, I literally just wanted to show you. This is the thinness of the Samsung Z Fold 7. So it's a super thin phone that folds. So you have a normal thickness phone with a big camera bump, to be fair. And then when you want to, you open it up and now you have a big screen to work with.
Oh man, wow.
And I just wanted to tie that in because I know you're an Apple phone user, and
Yep.
Apple is coming out with their own folding phone, 5-6 years after everybody else. Even Microsoft had a folding phone there for a while.
They did. Yep.
They're coming out next year with a folding iPhone, and the screen is apparently going to be made by Samsung, which I think is beautiful. That is so good. We are the leading tech company on the planet, and we fight with Samsung over who makes the best smartphones, and we can't make a folding screen, so we're going to ask our competitor to do it for us. I think that's beautiful.
Yep. People know that I'm in the Apple ecosystem, right, for a number of reasons. I will be the first to admit that you've got a large company there who used to be the market leader when it came to phones. They need to innovate a little bit more than they have been. I mean, they've been sticking to their tried and true design, and I mean, I love that about iPhones. They just work, but yeah, we need to try some different things, right? The one quote that still haunts me. I still facepalm when I think of it. You remember when they removed the headphone jack for the iPhones?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't remember who it was on stage at the I think it was their worldwide event that they do once a year around September. I don't remember who it was on stage. It wasn't the CEO, but this guy was on stage holding up this phone, and he was like, there's one word that describes, the fact that we're removing the headphone ports or the headphone jack or whatever. And he's like, courage. It took courage. And I'm like, dude, that's terrible. Like, what are you doing? You sound so cringy. Like, I mean, yeah, you're going to get flack for removing the headphone jack, but how about you just say, yeah, for design reasons, for waterproof reasons, we decided to remove the headphone jack, and okay, we're moving on. Like, that's all you had to say,
Or it's thinner, or it's lighter, because we don't have to include some good reason.
Right? Exactly. I still think about that, and I'm just like, it's so cringy. Anyway. Well, folks, I'll be sure to include the links to all the stuff that we talked about so far in the show notes. But what do you think, Paul? Should we talk about some conditional access?
Let's do it.
So, conditional access. I always, like to queue up these episodes and these main talking points with what is this thing we're talking about, right? And so conditional access, and Paul, I think this really ties into a previous episode you and I did where we talked about the fact that identity is the new firewall, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we all use SaaS services. Well, not all of us, but many of us use SaaS services, right? And because of the centralized and not centralized, I guess I should say distributed nature of cloud services and the fact that you can access them from anywhere, well, it makes it difficult to firewall it, right? And that's where identity comes into the equation. And so when we talk about conditional access, the way I always explain conditional access is basically you have a resource within M365, or the Microsoft Cloud in general that you want to access.
Mm-hmm.
So what conditional access does is, okay, you're logging in. Conditional access goes and looks at its policies, and a policy basically is just a set of criteria that you need to meet as the end user to access whatever resource it is you're trying to access. Yep. And that could be things like you have to access it from a machine that's registered with Intune, for example, and you have to log in with MFA, right?
Yep.
Now, you can get a lot more granular than that. That's just my simplistic example, but that's the way I always explain it. I don't know if you have anything you want to add, Paul.
No, the key's in the name, conditional access. What are the conditions that will allow you access to this resource? Now, remember, this resource here can be a lot of things, right? Of course, it can be SharePoint and, Outlook and Exchange Online or whatever, right? That's core. But it can also be Salesforce or, I don't know, some other SaaS apps, thousands and thousands and thousands of SaaS apps. It can also be an on-premises resource. We'll get to that a little bit later. Maybe you want to access a file share on premises? Well, you can use conditional access if you have global secure access, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So resource here is literally anything that you can fit into conditional access, and that's basically nearly everything. So that's important. The second thing really is that it is a zero trust engine. It is the policy engine inside of Microsoft's ecosystem that lets you apply policies for how do you, as an organization, trust particular users or guests or non-human identities, machine identities coming from workloads and things, to access X resources. How do you trust that, or how much do you trust that, or what policies do you need to be in place to verify that that trust is accurate for this particular sign-in? That's what conditional access gives you.
Yep, that's a lot of power, a lot of flexibility. Really, I've been using conditional access on and off for years, and I'm still amazed at the breadth of configuration options that you can do with it. Right?
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I always talk about when, I'm talking with somebody who's just getting started with conditional access, I always say every organization has to start with the basics. And typically nowadays, when you spin up a new 365 tenant, you get what Microsoft calls the security defaults, right?
Yes.
And I always forget exactly what's contained in the security defaults, but you've got things like enforced MFA.
Yep.
You have legacy authentication mechanisms are disabled.
Yes.
I feel like there's one or two others I can't think of off the top of my head, but those are the two that come to mind for me.
There's two things to think about here. First of all, you get security defaults if you do not have Entra ID P1.
Right.
So the first thing we should probably say when we talk about conditional access, you can only use conditional access policies if you have P1 or higher, which is P1 or P2. That means that if you have a I don't know how you get to not, because, business basic, right? So if you have a Microsoft 365 business basic account, not premium, because premium gives you P1, gives you conditional access policy. But if you have basics, you have no choice. Well, I mean, you can turn off security defaults and then you're really insecure because you can't use conditional access policy.
Okay.
But for every other organization, as long as you got business premium or higher, you can use conditional access policies. If you do, you have to disable security defaults. Because security defaults does not allow you to do any kind of custom conditional access policies. Behind the scenes, originally when they were bringing out security defaults, there were actually conditional access policies that Microsoft built, and you could see them, but you couldn't edit them. But they've gone away now. So I am going to assume that there's still, if you only have security defaults, there are conditional access policies in place. They live behind the scenes and you can't see them as a sysadmin. They're not even visible in the portal or in the API or anything. The last thing I'll point out is that security defaults does enforce MFA for everyone, but it is Microsoft Authenticator only.
Right.
Which means today it's actually not phishing resistant authentication. So it's good, like if you have a few users in a small business and you just want to get the basic protection in place, but it is not great because it is not phishing resistant and somebody can trick you into using your Authenticator app, the Microsoft Authenticator app specifically, to sign in, and they can capture your stuff.
Yep. And so one thing I wanted to point out is, if you're a organization with a smaller M365 tenant, what situation would you be in to get from, not using conditional access to then using it? I'll give you it's not a hypothetical. I mean, this is played out with the M365 tenant that I was configuring that I talked about earlier. So this particular tenant was fairly new. Started with business standard licenses, right? So with business standard, you don't get Entra ID P1 licensing. Hence, security defaults are really the only thing helping protect you from the mean, scary internet, right? And so, like you said, with security defaults, MFA is enforced for everyone and with Authenticator only. So I've got this tenant where okay, it's starting to be used for, it's more than just a kind of hobby tenant, right? It's starting to do some what I would call more production level stuff. And again, me being on the security side, how can things break? How can things be abused? I'm thinking like, okay, like this tenant is a for real tenant now in my mind. Like we need break glass accounts. So I need to configure break glass accounts. And there is a, I don't know how recent it is. It's somewhat recent. There is a new rule that in order to access any sensitive management portal, Entra ID management portal, for example, every account accessing those portals has to have MFA enforced now.
Mm-hmm.
And when we talk about break glass accounts, um, it was always best practice to basically make it so break glass accounts are they completely bypass conditional access.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole purpose of a break glass account is if for some reason you lose access to your admin accounts or logins are not working with your admin accounts, you have these break glass accounts that are only used for that oh crap situation.
Mm-hmm.
And they have all of the roadblocks and extra security mechanisms removed with the idea that you're going to give it a super long password. That password's going to go in a safe. Nobody's going to know what it is, and you only use it in those situations. Well, now it's required to have MFA. And what I'm thinking, break glass account, like this needs to be as simplistic as possible. I don't want to use an authenticator app for it, right? So where you end up is like, okay, I need to turn off MFA for, well, this is what prompted the entire thought process. It's like, well, and this is, I have to knock Microsoft for their documentation because their documentation was not entirely clear on that new MFA requirement. So I was still thinking like, okay, I have to do break glass accounts like the old way where I would disable MFA. I'd have a conditional access rule to allow that break glass login to just pass on through. But then I ran into the multi-factor authentication requirements. And so now I'm in a situation where I have to disable multi-factor authentication, or sorry, scratch that. I'm getting ahead of myself. I was in a position where I am like trying to disable multi-factor authentication for these break glass accounts. And I'm like, okay, I need conditional access. Oh, okay, I need Entra ID P1. Oh, I'll just upgrade this tenant to business premium, right? Which gives me Entra ID P1. Now, this is a long way. This is a long way of me getting around to this point. When you're in that situation where you need to put conditional access in place for the first time, you've got security defaults in place. You have to turn off security defaults. And here's the thing. If you just turn off security defaults, it used to be all of those settings just went away. But now there's, I'm glad that they added this. There is now a option in there where they ask you, why are you disabling security defaults? And you have the option of saying, I'm putting conditional access in place. And they ask you, do you want to recreate the security default rules in conditional access? And it just does it for you. It didn't always do that.
It didn't use to. That's beautiful. I didn't actually know that. I learned something new today. A quick step backwards for 1 second here. I just want to do another history lesson. The reason there was such a push for break glass accounts a good 7-8 years ago now in what was then Azure AD was that Microsoft had a number of high-profile outages, like worldwide, nobody can sign in, or you can sign in if you're not using MFA, because the thing that does MFA is broken, but if you're just using password, you're good to get in, right? And there were a number of businesses that didn't have anything like a break glass account, and their administrators were literally locked out, because what a business would want to do in that situation, right, like you've got 10,000 users that can't work because they can't sign in, you'd want to say, well, at the moment, it's more important for our business for these people to be able to work. So we're going to disable MFA company-wide for a few hours. Everybody can get in, they can work, and then we can enable MFA again afterwards, right? That's a business decision, and they should be able to do that. But if no administrator can get in, they can't actually make those changes.
That's a problem.
So that's why you need the break glass accounts, right? So that was the recommendation back then, so that at least you could get into your tenant. Or you have a smaller tenant and you fired all your global admin account users, and now you can't can't reset their passwords or something, some sort of situation where you're locked out of your tenant from an administrative point of view, and you need a break glass account to be able to get in. That was the historical reason why the break glass account concept came up.
Yep. And I've not witnessed it firsthand, but I've heard that if you're in a situation where you've lost access to your admin accounts and you don't have break glass, and you go to Microsoft and say, help, they will not help you bypass conditional access. That's what I've heard and read. I don't know that 100% fact, though.
I have heard other stories. So there's two things I'm going to mention here. That I have heard the story where you contact support, it will be escalated up, and they're going to ask you for everything under the sun plus a pint of your blood, because you're going to have to prove to Microsoft, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that this business tenant that they have had running for them in their cloud for 6 months, 6 years, whatever, right? You're actually them. You're not a bad guy trying to subvert the whole process and get the tenant over to you. You're actually a representative of that business. Now, obviously, if you've got thousands of users, whatever you have to do, you're going to use to prove that. But you should not have to end up in that situation. You should have break glass accounts. The other thing I wanted to point out is those high-profile outages in Entra ID, we don't see them anymore. And a main reason for that is that Microsoft has, over the last few years, re-architected Entra ID's internal gubbins in a huge way. And there was an interesting podcast that was only broadcast a couple of weeks ago. We'll put the link in the show notes. Again, Merrill Fernando, because he works in the identity space at Microsoft. He interviewed Tarek Daoud, who is another guy who's been at Microsoft Entra ID for a really long time. And they talked about how this architecture looks now and why we don't see those wide, big, huge impact outages. There are still outages, but nowhere near as big. You still break glass account, but the chance that MFA goes down completely, for example, but normal passwords work, that is not very likely to happen going forward.
Right. Yeah, I'll be sure we include a link to that in the show notes, folks. You can take a look at that. So, Paul, we were talking about what is conditional access, what do you need it for, and I just kind of jumped right into break glass accounts. But let's kind of back up for a second and talk a little bit more about the various pieces of conditional access, right? And we kind of alluded to it already, right? You have a policy, you have your user object, and whatever resource you're trying to access, right? And of course, scoping is one of the big things that you'll see mentioned inside of conditional access. And you can, I don't even know how many ways there are to scope a conditional access policy, because there's a lot. But, you could do it by users, groups, apps, like you talked about earlier. Conditions can be locations, a specific device, a risk level. So if a user has been deemed to have some risky actions happen to their accounts, okay, conditional access can force a reauth of multi-factor authentication rights. You can enforce certain types of authentication as well. So if you have, a SaaS app that is a financial application or something, you want to enforce FIDO2 key usage, you can do that for that particular app, right?
Yep. That's called authentication strength. I did want to, and I'll come to that in a second. I do want to mention the conditions as well. Other conditions that you can put in there is the account coming from an internal user or an external user. Are they coming from a company-owned device or a personal device? Are they coming from a particular OS platform? Obviously, iOS, Android, Windows, Mac OS, Linux. You can support all of those. Which network location are they coming from? So that lets you build more and more conditions around what you are willing to trust and what the endpoint needs to do to verify that trust as they're coming in. Now, it used to be that you could set in a policy that to access X resource, your finance application that you just mentioned, you had to enforce MFA. Now, that used to just include MFA, which meant that everything from a text message to the person's phone all the way up to a FIDO key were treated the same. A couple of years ago, Microsoft changed that. We now have something called authentication strength. You can still do the old policies, but they are not recommended anymore. So authentication strength is where you say these particular technologies is what I consider a strong authentication. And there are a few built-in ones like phishing resistant, for example, which includes Windows Hello, FIDO2 keys and pass keys. But you can also build your own. So you can say, my authentication strength for the finance application is that you have to have a FIDO2 key and it can only be these 5 models from this one brand. You can literally go down that far, right? And say, these are the keys we support. Even if you go and buy yourself a FIDO2 key and enroll it in your account, it's still not going to be good enough because we only accept these models if you really want to be that strict about it.
Right. Yep.
And I should also mention, interestingly, just to tie into what you were saying before, when you take a business basic into a business premium, you turn off security default, and it says, hey, we can create some conditional access policies for you. There are 2 or 3, depending on how your tenant is set up, Microsoft managed conditional access policies. Even if you've never had security defaults, you get some Microsoft ones that are there that you can use if you want to, right? And then you can, you can't edit those. You can scope them, but you can't edit the settings for them.
Right.
There's something else I was going to say, but you keep going. I'll see if it comes back.
No worries. I was going to, kind of move forward to our next talking point, and that is, it's a particularly important talking point, and that is, how do you design policies without locking everyone out? And I have to give Microsoft credit on this particular point, because you can't hardly scope anything in conditional access without getting the red pop-up, it's like, don't lock yourself out, right? So, I mean, Microsoft does a really good job of raising some red flags in the UI in conditional access to give you a heads up when whatever policy you're building could potentially lock you out. So I really like that they do that. But the thing that I've always done in the past is, unless there's some really urgent reason to implement something like right now, I have always started with my policies in report only mode. To me, it's, it's kind of like that what if switch on the command line, right? Hey, I have this thing I just configured. What happens if I put it into place? And conditional access is really good about reporting that. So you can see these are the failures that would happen if I turn this policy on. And, if there's some breakage in those failures that you need to resolve before you actually enable it, you have the chance to go and change your policy in order to not have that happen, right? So when you're configuring a policy that has far-reaching implications across your fleets, you definitely want to put that in report-only mode first. So
the times when those warnings show up is if you're doing all cloud resources, because that includes the Entra ID portal, right? So if you're just doing a policy for Salesforce or something, right, then it's not going to pop up, because sure, you could lock everybody out of Salesforce, but that's not a problem, because you can go back into the Entra ID portal, change your policy and go, whoops, I shouldn't have done whatever that locked everybody out. But if you lock yourself out of the Entra ID portal, you can't go back in and change the policy, which is why you get that warning. Now, report-only mode is really important because it allows you to go and then look and see and filter your sign-in logs and say, okay, for the 25 users that are accessing this particular application, if I enable this policy, which is currently in report-only mode, what would happen? And you can see where it will literally tell you in the conditional access, right? This will mean that these accounts will not be able to access it, or whatever, whatever the result is going to be there.
Yep. Super, super helpful there. So, and the other thing, we've kind of alluded to it, but I wanted to make sure we mention it because I had it written down as a sub point here, is you can layer policies, if you need to, right? So you can layer them on top of each other. What my recommendation has always been, when you start getting to the point where you're layering policies, make sure you really have a good understanding of what the policies are doing when you start layering things. Otherwise, you end up with this spaghetti situation mess that you have to troubleshoot, right? So
Design is important here, and that's why you can no longer treat conditional access policies like, oh yeah, we'll throw some basic ones in there, we're good to go, right? Like, it just doesn't work like that anymore. You got to really think this through and understand what scenarios are we protecting against? Do we have protections in place? If we put in an exception, right? So let's say that you have a policy that everybody has to do MFA, but then the CEO got locked out because he left his phone at home or something, and he was about to give a presentation to the board. You nearly got fired. Now you got to have an exception for PowerPoint access without having to do MFA or something. Well, do you have any compensating controls in place there as you're now moving to the next layer? Now, the one thing I wanted to come back to is, you mentioned user risk and sign-in risk and having policies for that. So I want to clarify that, because it's a really important thing, and it's something that not everybody understands. So if you have Entra ID P1 or even security defaults, Microsoft is tracking behind the scenes every user's risk, as in, this particular user account has done some weird things over the last few days, so we've increased their user risk to low or medium or high. And high would include things like, we have found, as in Microsoft has found, leaked credentials on the dark web. They have taken those credentials, seen that it's a Microsoft 365 account, taken the leaked password and run it against their own hashing algorithms, compared it with the password stored in Entra ID, and that could be an Active Directory account if it's synced to the cloud with password hash synchronization. They'll check that password and they'll say, this password is the same, so this user's credential is available to bad guys on the internet right now. Increase the risk level of this user account to high. They also look at every single sign-in, and they look at the riskiness of a sign-in coming from an unusual location, from an unknown device we've never seen before, coming from a different browser that we've never seen before, etc., etc., etc. But if you have, so all of that is happening in the background, you don't really see it. But if you have P2, you now get something called identity protection, which is an additional feature set in Entra ID. And if you have that, not only do you get reports on why people have a user risk elevated or a sign-in risk is elevated for a particular sign-in, but you can also build conditional access policies around this. Now, one thing is really important here is you need to have at least two. So you need to have a policy that says, let's start off maybe with high sign-in risk level, meaning this is a really funky sign-in, right? Like, this sign-in happening right now is a really strange one, coming from a country we've never seen this user sign in from before, and coming from a device we've never seen them from before. This smells very much like it's a bad guy. You then put in a conditional access policy that says, for high or maybe medium, you have to trim it for your organization, your risk appetite, do an extra MFA, right? Which means that as soon as that sign-in risk goes to high, that user is going to be prompted for an extra MFA at that sign-in. Even if they're only accessing a resource where they normally wouldn't have been prompted for MFA, you get an extra for that. So that's policy number one. For user risk, you need a different policy. You cannot put them in the same policy, because if you do, the only reason that policy would be triggered if the user risk and sign-in risk both are at the level that you've set. And that may not be true yet, right? So even if the risky sign-in is happening, the user hasn't been marked as risky yet. So you want a separate policy. For user risk policies, you can enforce a password reset. So if you're still using password plus MFA, the user is going to be said, hey, we can see that there's some risk associated with your account. You have to go to the self-service password reset portal. You have to reset your password to a new password because we found yours leaked out on the internet, or whatever the reason might be, and now your risk level goes down. So important thing here is that for both user risk and sign-in risk, the end users remediate the risks themselves if you put the policies in place. If you do not have those policies in place, you will get a report at the end of the week emailed to you as an administrator saying, hey, there was a risky sign-in 4 days ago. That's a bit late.
Just a bit.
That's a tad late to find out that there's a problem, right? So you want to have these policies in place to catch this stuff. Now, it gets a little bit funky when you go to, say, you're going to passkeys and you have a user risk that goes high for a passkey user. Today, they will still be sent off to reset their password. And I'm like, I don't have a password. I don't know what my password is. I only use passkeys. I don't even have a password. I don't know what my password is. And so there's some funkiness there before everybody gets to move to phishing resistant, which is going to take us some few years. But
it'll be a while. Yep.
So
that's a nice segue into the last area I wanted to talk about, and that is, I guess some futures of conditional access. I've seen some chatter out on the interwebs. I've seen things like, AI-driven risk detection and policies. So, I mean, Microsoft has gone big with AI and security. You got Security Copilot, right? So I'm sure they're going to use all that threat intelligence to help drive that risky user detection algorithm in some way, shape, or form, right?
Yeah, and they did that long before we got the LLM-based AI that I'll talk about in a second. So the identity protection, the risky sign-ins, and the risky user detections, they're of course using machine learning.
Yeah.
Behind the scenes, if you want to know something really cool, Microsoft has a technology called Titan, which actually stands for something like it's a backronym for something or other, but threat intelligence, something. I don't know exactly. Right. But point is, they have a system where when they get signals from any of their security tools running in any corporate environment, they're fed back into Titan, and if they are identified as malicious, they will automatically be flagged. So Andy signs into his Microsoft 365 tenant that you've been working on here, and let's say some bad guy got hold of your credentials and they sign in, and that we see that, or Microsoft sees that, they're going to then flag the IP address, for example, where that signing came from, and then when one of my users in one of my tenants a few minutes later try to sign in, they will be flagged as high risk because they're coming from the same, they've been tricked into using that same IP address, something along those lines.
Right.
So that's number one. Now, number two is you mentioned Security Copilot. So for those of you who don't know, Microsoft has a Copilot for security, which started its life in Defender and Sentinel, but it has now infiltrated every other portal on the planet, including Intune, Entra ID, Purview, and everywhere else. If you have Security Copilot deployed in your tenant, which means that you have assigned at least one secure compute unit at $4 per hour, and Microsoft recommends you keep running this thing 24/7, 365, and they recommend a minimum of 3, which means that you're looking at just under 100,000 a year just to have this thing running. But if you have that, and maybe you scale it down overnight or something, if you're not a huge business, you can enable something that's in a public preview at the moment, which is the Conditional Access agent. This lives in your Entra ID portal, and it runs every 24 hours, and it specifically looks at your conditional access policies, and it tells you if any of your policies have not caught new user accounts you have created, for example. That's one of the things it looks for, right? So you add a few users, but you didn't put them in the right groups or something, and they are now not covered by the policies they should be covered by. This policy this agent will tell you that. So it runs every 24 hours. There's a few other things it looks for as well. So that's now available in public preview. You can play with that. And the last thing, I do want to return to Meister because I think it's really important.
Yep.
So because conditional access has become so important to enterprises worldwide, and there's a lot to think about here, even for small businesses, certainly for a large business. Meister.dev is the URL. It is, as I said, a free tool built on the PowerShell Pester framework, but you don't see that as an end user unless you want to go and dig into the gubbins there. You run this interactively against a tenant, and it will produce an HTML report with every policy you have configured for that is covering a particular risk, you get a green tick and you're good to go, or you get a red warning. And for each of those red warnings, it'll tell you why you need to have a policy, or you need to change a particular configuration for a policy to match best practices. You can, of course, also say, no, for my particular scenario, we've done it this way because of blah, blah, blah. And then in the future runs, you can sort of not get that warning for that particular.
Right.
It started with just running against your conditional access policies. Now it runs against lots more Entra ID configuration and Exchange Online configuration, I think.
Oh, nice. I didn't know about that one.
No, they've built in the CIS benchmark, so you can run against the CIS benchmarks and tell you what you've got missing there. So, and it's completely free. And next step, of course, which is what I've been working for for one of my clients at the moment, is setting this up to run regularly. So I've set up my GitHub repo, looking at GitHub Actions to have this thing run every 24 hours, and then I can go and look at these reports afterwards and start, slowly eating the large animal. We don't eat elephants, please, but eating the elephant by fixing each of these things.
That's a great tool, and you mentioned Merrill Fernando. It was there's two other Microsoft MVPs that are involved as well, if I remember correctly. You mentioned earlier.
That's right.
Merrill creates a ton of amazing Entra related content.
Yeah.
So I will put a link to some of Merrill's resources in the show notes as well. So
he's got a good conditional access documentation tool. Actually, we should briefly mention that as well before we leave the conditional access topic. Number one, he's got a documentation tool, again, free for conditional access. So you log into his identity tools website, you sign into your tenant, it will actually produce a PowerPoint of all things. So it'll produce a PowerPoint of each page on the PowerPoint, or each slide in the PowerPoint gives you the documentation for all of what's set in that conditional access policy. It also used to be that you couldn't really back up your conditional access policies short of sort of writing down how they were documented. That's possible, and that's been possible for a few years now. You can use PowerShell commandlets to back up your conditional access policies and put them somewhere, and you can also restore them using PowerShell.
Yeah, because that's a big one. I've seen some fairly elaborate conditional access configurations over the years, and it reminds me of the old group policy days. I wouldn't want to have to rebuild everything group policy from scratch. Same applies to conditional access. Forget it. No, thank you.
No, you don't want to, and you do need to have good documentation in place there, because should you ever have a problem with them, you could end up in a scenario where you literally will need to start from scratch. So you do want to have them documented. It is also something that the bad guys will attack if they can. So if they get an account that has enough permissions, if they're being blocked from getting to where they want to get by conditional access, they will literally just go and change the policy. Right? They don't need to be a global admin for that. Security admin does it, and a few other roles that they can get in and do that with. So, for example, in my tenants where I use Sentinel, which is nearly all of them, I have analytics rules that tell me whenever a conditional access policy is changed. Now, that normally comes up as an alert telling me that I did it, because I know when I change something, and none of my clients should ever change their own conditional access policies. But if anything ever happens, I find out about it and I can go, hang on, somebody should not be messing with my conditional access policies.
And that's a good mention, especially when we go back to the break glass conversation as well, too. So if you have break glass accounts configured, that's what I did with this particular tenant I was talking about. I set up a log analytics workspace, and same thing. I have a rule that runs, and anytime one of those break glass accounts logs in, I get a big fat alert that says, hey, this account was used, right? So, because I want to know. But yeah, the one about alert on change to conditional access policy, that's a good one too.
Yeah, it is a good one. And I will tie it off here with the break glass account, since you reminded me. So I'm an MSP. I have a small handful of clients. For each of those clients, when the new recommendations or the new requirements came in that you had to have an MFA method, so you had to change everyone's break glass accounts, I bought two YubiKeys for each of my tenants. I configured both YubiKeys for two break glass accounts, right? So there's two accounts and two YubiKeys, but they are both on both keys. And then I put the PIN code and all the other information you need to go with that into an envelope, and then I gave each client gets their one YubiKey and an envelope with all the details they need for that account, the name of the account and whatever, and they put that in their safe. That means two things. If I'm not around for some reason and they need to get into their tenant, they can do that, right? Like if I don't win the lottery and I didn't bother telling them how I flew off to a permanent holiday, or something dreadful happens to me, they have that still because they got that YubiKey, they got the instructions, they can use it to get back into their tenant.
Yep, that's exactly what I did with this particular tenant too. Two YubiKeys, each YubiKey has, each of the two break glass accounts on it, and one went in a safe, and well, one's with me most of the time. So, but yes. Anyway, man, with conditional access, one of those topics where I feel like we covered a lot, but not everything. So I could see us talking about conditional access again at some point. I'd be interested, folks, if you have any interesting conditional access stories, or you're using conditional access in some really interesting way, go ahead and let us know. You can leave a comment, on the YouTube video if you're watching this on YouTube, or if you're listening on Spotify, you can leave a comment there as well. Or again, a reminder, you can reach us at contact@sysadminweekly.com as well. I've always mentioned I really want to involve the community. I love talking about comments on the show. Two recent episodes, if you're up to date on the show, we've actually covered some of our very first comments, at the beginning of the show, which is really fun to do. So it's always interesting to get different viewpoints, hear what people are working on, and it's a good time. So again, if you have any comments, thoughts, funny jokes, whatever, you feel free to let us know, and we'll include it on the show if we can. So anyway, Paul, I want to thank you for spending some of your very valuable time with us. It's always good talking to you, my friend.
Yeah, that was a great conversation. And I got to mention before I forget, there's no priority in conditional access policies. Sorry, I know we're wrapping up, but there's no priority. They all get mushed together. And if you have 5 different these with different conditions, you got to fulfill all 5 different ones.
Yep.
So
that's a good mention. And like I said, it's one of those topics that I just constantly, and this, and this.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and this,
it's a lot there. There's a lot there.
There is a lot there. So, well, again, appreciate it, Paul. Good talking to you. And folks, appreciate you spending some time with us as well. So hopefully you found some value in today's episode. And if you did, you can always hit that like and subscribe button if you want. So we're also available. I've mentioned Spotify and YouTube. We're also available out on Amazon podcasts. We are also available on Apple Podcasts. Sorry, I had a brain fart there for a second. I'm like, I know there's another one, but Apple Podcasts. We're available there as well, too. So chances are, wherever you consume your podcasts, you can find us. And one last reminder, you can find the newsletter at newsletter.sysadminweekly.com. With that, we'll let you get back to your day. Stay safe out there. Glad to have you again. And we'll see you again next week for another episode of SysAdmin Weekly. Have a good one.